Thank you for honoring Latin American Heritage Month and inviting me to share some stories as a Mexican American. Perhaps the most famous legend in Mexico is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Juan Diego was an indigenous peasant of the Nahuatl tribe. He was walking on December 12th, 1531, in the early years of the Spanish colonization of what is now called Mexico. An apparition of what is believed to be the Virgin Mary appeared to him on a hill called Tepeyac, where the Spanish had recently destroyed a temple to the Aztec mother goddess Tonantzin, whose name translates to our sacred mother. The apparition is described as a young woman with black hair and darkened skin, which is why the Virgin of Guadalupe is sometimes referred to as La Virgen Morena, or the brown-skinned virgin. When Mary appeared to him, she spoke to him in his native language of Nahuatl. The Virgin told Juan Diego to go and tell the local bishop to build a church on this hill in her honor, and Juan Diego did as he was told. However, the bishop was left unconvinced by the story. The Virgin appeared to Juan Diego again, and on the second occasion told Juan to collect flowers from the top of the hill. Being December, Juan did not expect to find any, but upon his arrival, he found the hill covered in Castilian roses. As instructed, he collected some roses and, using his overcoat to carry them, returned to show the bishop. The bishop, seeing the unseasonable flowers, also saw an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe imprinted inside of Juan Diego's coat. Convinced it was a miracle, he ordered the building of the church on the hill of Tepeyac, at the precise location where the current-day basilica is situated in Mexico City. It is said at that second appearance, the Virgin spoke to Juan, and she said, "Am I not here, I who am your mother?" These words are inscribed at the entrance of the basilica still today. The fact that Mary appeared before an indigenous peasant rather than the bishop himself is reminiscent of so many other stories where the divine chooses to work with the lowly, the humble, and the oppressed. Even now in Mexico and the US, there is serious division, and those with indigenous features do not enjoy equal status as those with European features. This story reminds us that the glory of the divine seeks out the poor and the marginalized. When I began to prepare this talk, I thought would be the whole story. This is where most recounts of the Virgin of Guadalupe end. However, as I researched a bit deeper, another story emerged altogether. The legend is that the apparition of the Virgin spoke to Juan Diego in his native language of Nahuatl. Tepeyac was a sacred place to the Nahuatl. Many people traveled for miles to it even after the Spanish destroyed the temple of Tonantzin. So Juan Diego wasn't just out for a walk. He was on a pilgrimage to pay homage to the mother goddess Tonantzin. So when she said, "Am I not here, I who am your mother?" Was the apparition the Virgin Mary of the Catholic Church, or was she indeed claiming that she was the mother goddess Tonantzin? She has been recognized by the Catholic Church as a manifestation of the Virgin Mary, and the Catholic Church controls the narrative, and that is the story that most people know. However, many people with indigenous heritage believe that the Virgin of Guadalupe and Tonantzin are one and the same. By either name, the sacred figure enabled the emergence of Mexico as a unified nation, despite the attempt by Spain to destroy pre-Hispanic civilizations and belief systems. This may explain why the indigenous people of that area have become some of the most devoted Catholics. It was the only way they could practice and honor their indigenous deities under Spanish rule. Our Lady of Guadalupe is the national symbol of Mexico, an image we can find on tattoos, military flags, clothing, and street art. To many, she is a symbol of affirmation of indigenous beliefs hidden in plain sight of the colonizer. The Virgin of Guadalupe is viewed by many to be a protector of indigenous peoples. This story illuminates the struggle of colonized people to assimilate into the dominant culture for survival or to maintain the authenticity of their traditions and risk everything. Though Mexico was colonized almost 500 years ago, this struggle is still relevant. And I would dare say in our country as well. To this day, most Mexicans have both indigenous and Spanish blood. There is still a pervasive cultural hierarchy in Mexico where lighter-skinned Mexicans enjoy higher status in all regards than people with more indigenous features. There is a saying, said sometimes in humor, but there's seriousness underneath. The saying is mejor la raza, which translates to improve the race, implicating that having children with someone with lighter skin than you will elevate your family's position and thus the entire Mexican race. I am the daughter of a Mexican immigrant. My father was born one of 8 children to poor parents in Jalisco, Mexico. He would tell the story of an excruciating tooth infection that went untreated because there was no money for a dentist. After this experience, he vowed to do everything he could to never be poor as an adult. He came to Chicago as a young man determined to achieve the American dream. After he'd been here less than a year, in the late 60s, ICE invaded the meatpacking plant where he worked, and he was deported. He was dating my American mom at the time, and she recalls how he just disappeared and then suddenly reappeared months later. They married quickly, at least in part because it was his pathway to citizenship. He achieved his goal of elevating out of poverty. Our family was middle class. When my brother and I were little, my dad worked 3 jobs while attending college. He graduated with a bachelor's in accounting that he would never use. He believed he never got hired as an accountant because of his Mexican accent and dark skin. Desperate to assimilate, he took speech therapy to remove his accent. It never worked. Once I graduated from college, I felt a strong desire to immerse myself in my Mexican heritage. I got a job at an orphanage near Tijuana. I became fluent in Spanish, and I fell in love with the culture of color, music, patience, and humility. A culture that still reflected the values and vibrancy of its indigenous history. I had hoped my dad would be proud of my venture, but he was totally against my move to Mexico. He wouldn't even speak to me for some time. I'm guessing this is why. He had worked so hard to assimilate to what he considered a more prestigious way of life, a safer way of life. By way of marriage to an Irish woman, he had given his children the gift of light skin privilege, for which I must have seemed entirely ungrateful. My dad had internalized the cultural hierarchy that values fitting in with the dominant class and devalues the ways of his ancestry. He eventually did come around and I think once said that he was proud that I took an interest in all things Mexico. Now, I don't begrudge my dad at all for doing what he needed to do and for clinging to the beliefs that he needed to in order to survive and assimilate into the dominant culture. He sacrificed a lot to give me a very different childhood than he had, one of far more privilege. Privilege lacks awareness. That's nobody's fault. I'll never know what an untreated tooth infection feels like, and I'll never know what it feels like to have the darkest skin in the room. And in that safety and privilege of my light skin and European features, I get to speak today on behalf of those with less privilege. I speak on behalf of the people who feed us, who are willing to work for pennies on the dollar to grow almost every bit of produce we purchase and eat from the grocery store. I speak on behalf of the over 30,000 migrant children that ICE lost this year. These children are missing because they were separated from their loving parents as punishment for being too poor to get the necessary documents before crossing the border. So as I speak for them today, I ask you for mercy, for your mercy in your thoughts and words about them. I ask for your advocacy. And I ask us all to question our pervasive cultural beliefs that value some lives more than others. What biases may be hidden in our beliefs and even in our faith? And what can we do to decolonize them? The short answer is we can't. Not totally. We are born into a culture that values some people more than it does others. That's not our fault, and we can't help but be impacted by these cultural values that we've been breathing in since birth. However, there are some things we can do to grow our awareness and make space for other beliefs, cultures, and in doing so, improve our race. One is listen to and believe people with less privilege than you. 2, compassionately assess our own beliefs and make space for others. And I say compassionately because without self-compassion, this work is impossible. We have to start there by making room for ourselves and our own beliefs and to kind of let ourselves off the hook a little bit so that we can really take a deeper look without getting defensive or resistant. 3, consider who is controlling the narrative, and if there could be more to the story than what meets the eye, especially on mainstream news, I'm going to say. And finally, remember who the divine chooses to work with. Thank you very much.